It's not our fault that we repeatedly get depressed. We start to feel bad, and before we know it, we've been pulled down into the spiral, and no amount of struggle will get us out. In fact, the more we struggle, the deeper we end up mired. We may blame ourselves for feeling bad in the first place, and especially for feeling worse the more we think about it. But what is really at work is a certain mental pattern or mode of mind that is triggered so automatically by unpleasant emotion that we hardly notice or know what is actually happening. To see these mental mechanisms for what they are, we have to explore emotion and how we react to it. This exploration will reveal exactly how the struggle itself pulls us down, and how unjust it is to blame ourselves. Even more important, understanding that it is a certain mode of mind that gets us stuck opens the door to an alternative way of dealing with emotion, making a radical shift to a different mode of mind. Within that very shift, practiced over and over again in key moments, lies the possibility of transforming our relationship with depression and freeing ourselves from its grip. On one important level, our emotions are vital messengers. They evolved as signals to help us meet our basic needs for self-preservation and safety, and to survive individually and as a species. They tell us what to do to survive and even thrive. For the most part, our emotional reactions evolved to be temporary. They have to be. The messenger needs to be alert to the need to signal the next alarm. The problem with persistent and recurrent depression is not getting sad in the first place. Sadness is a natural mind state, an inherent part of being human. It is neither realistic nor desirable to imagine that we can or should get rid of it. The problem is what happens next, immediately after the sadness comes. The problem is not the sadness itself, but how our minds react to the sadness. The fact is that when emotions are telling us that something is not as it should be, the feeling is distinctly uncomfortable. It's meant to be. The signals are exquisitely designed to push us to act, to do something to rectify the situation. When the problem that our emotions signal needs to be solved is out there, a charging bull or a roaring funnel cloud, reacting in a way that will allow us to avoid it or escape from it makes perfect sense. The brain mobilizes a whole pattern of mostly automatic reactions that help us deal with whatever is threatening our survival, helping us to get rid of it or avoid the threat. We call this initial pattern of reactions, in which we feel negatively toward and want to avoid or eliminate something, aversion. Aversion forces us to act in some appropriate way to the situation and thereby turn off the warning signal. In this regard, it can serve us well. It can even save our lives, sometimes. But it's not hard to see that the same reactions are going to be counterproductive and even dangerous to our well-being when directed at what's going on in here, toward our own thoughts, feelings, and sense of self. None of us can run fast enough to escape our own inner experience, nor can we eliminate unpleasant, oppressive, and threatening thoughts and feelings by fighting with them and trying to annihilate them. When we react to our own negative thoughts and feelings with aversion, the brain circuitry involved in physical avoidance is activated. Once this mechanism is switched on, the body tenses as if it were either getting ready to run or bracing itself for an assault. We can also sense the effects of aversion in our minds. When we are preoccupied, dwelling on how to get rid of our feelings of sadness or disconnection, our whole experience is one of contraction. The mind, driven to focus on the compelling yet futile task of getting rid of these feelings, closes in on itself. And with it, our experience of life itself narrows. Somehow we feel cramped, boxed in. the choices available to us seem to dwindle. We come to feel increasingly cut off from the wider space of possibilities that we long to connect with. Over our lifetime, we may have come to dislike or even hate emotions such as fear, sadness, or anger in ourselves and in others. If we have, for example, been taught not to be so emotional, we will have picked up the message that expression of emotion is somewhat unseemly, and may have assumed it wasn't okay to feel emotion either. Or maybe we remember clearly the drawn-out feeling of an emotional experience like grief, and now react with dread when a hint of a similar feeling arises. When we react negatively with aversion to our own negative emotions, treating them as enemies to be overcome, eradicated, and defeated, we get into trouble. So understanding aversion becomes fundamental to understanding what gets us stuck in persistent unhappiness. We run into problems because the unhappiness we are feeling now triggers old, extraordinarily unhelpful patterns of thinking from the past. To understand this, we have to understand a little bit about our memory. Let's think about that now. Have you ever visited a place that you haven't been to for many years, perhaps since childhood? Before the visit, memory of things that happened at that time of your life may be quite sketchy, but once you get there, walking down the streets, taking in the smells and the sounds may bring it all back, not just memories, but feelings of excitement, of sorrow, of first love. Returning to the place, the old context, does something that our best efforts to remember could not do nearly as well. Context has incredibly powerful effects on memory. Over the past few years, psychologists have discovered something really important about how our emotional states can have such a pervasive effect on our minds. A mood can function as an internal context, bringing back memories and patterns of thinking that are associated with times when we were in that mood. When we return to that mood, thoughts and memories related to whatever was going on in our mind or world to make us unhappy will come back quite automatically, whether we want it to happen or not. When the mood comes up again, so do the thoughts and memories connected with it, including the thinking patterns that created that mood. If the main things that made us sad in the past were losses, such as the sad but expected death of a beloved grandparent, when we feel passing sadness now, these will be the memories that come to mind. We may feel sad again, but we may have no trouble acknowledging our loss and then shifting the focus of the mind to other things, while the echo of the grief fades in its own time. But what if our previous moods of unhappiness or depression were evoked by situations that somehow led to our thinking and feeling that we were not good enough, that we were worthless, that we were a fraud? What if, in childhood or adolescence, at a time when we did not have the life skills we now have, we experienced overwhelming feelings of being abandoned, abused, lonely, or just plain no good? Sadly, we now know that many people who become depressed as adults have had just such experiences in the past. If, for us, they were a significant part of childhood, the thinking patterns that made us depressed then, the sense that we're not good enough in some way, are highly likely to be reactivated in the present, even by a passing feeling of depression. That is why we can react so negatively to unhappiness. Our experience is not one simply of sadness, but is coloured powerfully by reawakened feelings of deficiency or inadequacy. What may make these reactivated thinking patterns most damaging is that we often don't realise they are memories at all. We feel not good enough now, without being aware that it is a thinking pattern from the past that is evoking the feeling. Once negative memories, thoughts or feelings reactivated by unhappy moods have forced their way into our consciousness, they produce two major effects. First, naturally enough, they increase our unhappiness, depressing mood even further. Second, they will bring with them a set of seemingly urgent priorities for what the mind has absolutely got to focus on, our deficiencies and what we can do about them. It is these priorities that dominate the mind and make it so difficult to switch attention to anything else. Thus, we find ourselves compulsively trying over and over to get to the bottom of what is wrong with us as people or with the way we live our lives, and try to fix it. Caught up in this way, how on earth could we possibly contemplate switching our attention away from these pressing and understandable concerns to focus on other topics or approaches, even if doing so might contribute to a lightening of our mood? Sorting things out and forcing a solution will always seem like the most compelling thing to do. Figuring out what it is that is not good enough about us, sorting out what we need to do to minimize the havoc that our unhappiness will wreak in our lives if it persists. But, in fact, focusing on these issues in this way simply fuels further unhappiness and keeps us fixated on the very thoughts and memories that are making us unhappy. We can't change the fact that past memories and self-critical and judgmental ways of thinking are triggered when we feel unhappy. It all happens quite automatically. But we may be able to change what happens next. We can learn to relate differently to our unhappiness. The first step is to see even more clearly the ways in which we entangle ourselves. In particular, we need to become more aware of the pattern or mode of mind that gets switched on and can cause so much suffering. When the thinking reawakened by depressed mood tells us that we are the problem, we want to get rid of these feelings right now. But larger issues have been triggered and dredged up. It's not just that today is not going well. Our whole life feels as if it's not going well. We feel caught in a prison. We feel we have to find a way to escape. The problem is that we try to think our way out of our moods by working out what's gone wrong. We put all of our mental powers to work on the problem, and the power we rely on is that of our critical thinking skills. Unfortunately, those critical thinking skills might be exactly the wrong tools for the job. We're rightly proud of what we can do through critical analytic thinking. It's one of the highest achievements of our evolutionary history as human beings, and does get us out of a whole slew of fixes in life. So when we see things are not going well in our internal emotional life, it's hardly surprising that the mind often quickly reacts by recruiting the mode of mind that functions so effectively in solving problems in our external world. This mode of careful analysis, problem-solving, judgment and comparison is aimed at closing the gap between the way things are and the way we think they should be, at solving perceived problems. Therefore, we call it the doing mode of mind. It's the mode by which we respond to what we hear as a call to action. Doing mode is mobilized because it usually works very well in helping us to achieve our goals in everyday situations and in solving work-related technical problems. If there is something we want to happen, we focus on narrowing the gap between our idea of where we are now and our idea of where we want to be. If there is something we don't want to happen, we focus on increasing the gap between our idea of where we are and our idea of what we want to avoid. This doing mode of mind not only enables us to manage the routine details of our daily lives, but also underlies some of the most awe-inspiring accomplishments of the human species in transforming the external world, from the construction of the pyramids to the engineering feat of modern skyscrapers to putting a man on the moon. All these achievements required exquisite and elegant problem-solving of a certain kind. It is quite natural, then, that the same mental strategies should get recruited when we want to transform our interior world, to change ourselves so that we can attain happiness, for example, or get rid of unhappiness. Unfortunately, this is where things can start to go horribly wrong. Imagine yourself walking along a path by a river on a sunny day. You're feeling a little down, a little out of sorts. You think, it's a lovely day. I should be feeling happy. Let that thought sink in. I should be feeling happy. How do you feel now? If you feel worse, you're not alone. Virtually everyone reports the same response. Why? Because in the case of our moods, the very act of focusing on the gap, comparing how we are feeling with how we want to feel or how we think we should feel, makes us feel unhappy. This takes us even further away from how we want to be. Focusing on the gap in this way is actually a reflection of the mind's habitual strategy for trying to sort out situations in which things aren't as we want them to be. Normally, if our mood is not too intense, we may hardly notice the slight downturn in our feelings when we make a comparison between how we feel and how we'd like to feel. However, if the mind is in doing mode, trying to solve problems like what's wrong with me and why am I so weak, we can get trapped in the very thinking that was recruited to rescue us. The mind will naturally bring up and then hold in consciousness the relevant ideas it is working on. So if you're not feeling too good, you may have an idea of the sort of person you are right now as being sad and lonely, and the idea of the kind of person you want to be, peaceful and happy. And then the mind will hold the third idea, the kind of the person you fear you might become if the sadness persists and you sink into depression, pathetic and weak maybe. The doing mode then focuses on the mismatch between these ideas, the way in which we are not the people we want to be. Focusing on the mismatch between our idea of the person we want to be and our idea of the person we see ourselves as makes us feel worse than we did in the first place when the doing mode started its attempts to help. The doing mode uses mental time travel to help, calling up past times when we may have felt like this in an effort to understand what went wrong then, and then imagining a future blighted by unhappiness to remind us that this is what we desperately need to avoid. The memories of previous failures and the images of feared future scenarios that we bring to mind in the process add their own twist to the spiral of worsening mood. The more we've suffered low mood in the past, the more negative will be the images and self-talk unlocked by our present mood, and the more our mind will be dominated by these old patterns, but they seem real to us now. These patterns of feeling worthless or lonely feel familiar. But instead of seeing the feeling of familiarity as a sign that the mind is going down an old mental groove, we take the feeling of familiarity to mean that it must all be true. That's why we can't snap out of it, as our family and friends may have been urging. We cannot let go, because the doing mode of mind insists that our highest priority is to sort ourselves out by identifying and solving this problem. So we just hammer ourselves with more questions. Why do I always react this way? Why can't I handle things better? Why do I have problems other people don't have? What am I doing to deserve this? You may think of this self-focused, self-critical frame of mind as brooding. Psychologists also call it rumination. When we ruminate, we become fruitlessly preoccupied with the fact that we are unhappy and with the causes, meanings, and consequences of our unhappiness. Research has repeatedly shown that if we have tended to react to our sad or depressed mood in these ways in the past, then we are likely to find the same strategy volunteering to help again and again when our mood starts to slide. And it will have the same effect. we'll get stuck in the very mood from which we are trying to escape. As a consequence, we are at even higher risk of experiencing repeated bouts of depression. Why then do we ruminate? Why do we continue to dwell on thoughts about our unhappiness when it just seems to make things worse? We ruminate when we feel low because we believe that it will reveal a way to solve our problems. But research shows that rumination does exactly the opposite. Our ability to solve problems actually deteriorates markedly during rumination. All the evidence seems to point to the stark truth that rumination is part of the problem, not part of the solution. Rumination invariably backfires. It merely compounds our misery. It's a heroic attempt to solve a problem that it is just not capable of solving. Another mode of mind altogether is required when it comes to dealing with unhappiness. There is an alternative strategy for handling the negative moods, memories, and thinking patterns in the present moment as they arise. Evolution has bequeathed us an alternative to critical thinking, and we humans have only just begun to realize its power to transform us. It is called awareness. In a sense, we've been familiar with this alternative capacity of ours all along. It's just that the doing mode of mind has eclipsed it. This capacity does not work by critical thinking, but through awareness itself. We call it the being mode of mind. We don't only think about things, we also experience them directly through our senses. We are capable of directly sensing and responding to things like tulips, cars, and a cold wind. And we can be aware of ourselves experiencing. We have intuitions about things and feelings. We know things not only with the head, but also with the heart and with the senses. Furthermore, we can be aware of ourselves thinking. Thinking is not all there is to conscious experience. The being mode is an entirely different way of knowing from the thinking of the doing mode. Not better, just different. But it gives us a whole other way of living our lives and of relating to our emotions, our stress, our thoughts and our bodies. And it is a capacity that we all already have. It's just been a bit neglected and underdeveloped. Being mode is the antidote to the problems that the doing mode of mind creates. By cultivating the awareness of being mode, we can get out of our heads and learn to experience the world directly, experientially, without the relentless commentary of our thoughts. We might just open ourselves to the limitless possibilities for happiness that life has to offer us. In being mode, we can see our thoughts as mental events that come and go in the mind like clouds across the sky, instead of taking them literally. The idea that we're no good, unlovable and ineffectual can finally be seen as just that, an idea, and not necessarily as the truth, which just might make it easier to disregard. In being mode, we can start living right here in each present moment. When we let go of dwelling on the past or worrying about the future, we become open to rich sources of information we've been missing out on, information that can keep us out of the downward spiral and poised for a richer life. In being mode, we can disengage the autopilot in our heads. Being more aware of ourselves through the senses, the emotions and the mind can help us aim our actions where we really want them to go and make us more effective problem solvers. In being mode, we can sidestep the cascade of mental events that draws us down into depression. When awareness is cultivated, we may be able to recognize at an early stage the times we are most likely to slide into depression and respond to our mood in ways that keep us from being pulled down further. In being mode, we can stop trying to force life to be a certain way because we're uncomfortable right now. we'll be able to see that wanting things to be different from how they are right now is where rumination begins. The rest of this audio program describes in detail how you can cultivate the type of awareness we're talking about. The core skill is mindfulness. It can profoundly change your life. So, what exactly is mindfulness? Mindfulness is the awareness that emerges through paying attention on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally to things as they are. Pay attention to what, you might ask? To anything, but especially to those aspects of life that we most take for granted or ignore. For instance, we might start paying attention to the basic components of experience, like how we feel, what is on our minds, and how we perceive or know anything at all. Mindfulness means paying attention to things as they actually are in any given moment, however they are, rather than as we want them to be. Why does paying attention in this way help? Because it is the exact antithesis to the type of ruminative thinking that makes low moods persist and return. First, mindfulness is intentional. When we are cultivating mindfulness, we can be more aware of present reality and the choices available to us. We can act with awareness. By contrast, rumination is often an automatic reaction to whatever triggers us. It is tantamount to unawareness, being lost in thought. Second, mindfulness is experiential. It focuses directly on present moment experience. By contrast, rumination propels our thoughts into the past or into an imagined future. Third, mindfulness is non-judgmental. Its virtue is that it allows us to see things as they actually are in the present moment and to allow them to be as they already are. By contrast, judging and evaluating are integral to rumination and the entire doing mode. The habit of judging ourselves severely disguises itself as an attempt to help us live better lives and to be better people. But in actuality, the habit of judging winds up functioning as an irrational tyrant that can never be satisfied. Practicing mindfulness is more than just noticing things around us that we hadn't noticed before. It is learning to become aware of the particular mode of mind that gets us stuck when misapplied to ourselves and our emotional life. As you'll see, the practice of mindfulness teaches us to shift into being mode so that we can be more at peace with our emotions. Our emotions are not the enemy after all, but messages that reconnect us in the most basic and intimate of ways with the adventure and experience of being alive.